Hello and welcome to the opening night of the Wigtown Book Festival 2020 in its digital format. I'm Lee Randall and I'm delighted both to be here in my home from home, Wigtown, and to be talking with my friend Shaun Bythell, who owns the Bookshop. Before we get started, a bit of the housekeeping. You surely know by now that there are buttons everywhere on the website where you can buy books, where you can make donations to help keep events like this coming. We really hope, if you're able to, that you'll support both our authors and our festival. And we do appreciate every bit of help we get from you. There's also a chat function, various ways that you can ask questions. They will then show up on a little iPad here, and we'll get to some of those at the end of the event. So, you probably know that many people have visited the Bookshop in person. They've walked amid its more than mile of shelving, they've cozied up before the open fire, they've ducked under the flying skeleton, and they've marveled at the Kindle mounted like a trophy. But many, many more have visited the shop from the comfort of their homes around the world, not unlike the audience is doing tonight. And they visited via Shaun's two international bestsellers, The Diary of a Bookseller and Confessions of a Bookseller. These funny, poignant books take us through 2 years in the life of the Bookshop and the town, which found a new lease in life as Scotland's national book town. Now, the newest book, which I cannot hold it up, Shaun, I can't help noticing that it's exactly the right size for stocking stuffer, and Christmas is around the corner. It is called 7 Kinds of People You Find in Bookshops. In it, Shaun affectionately nibbles the hands that feed him, describing the sorts of customers who cross his threshold. I was going to say each day, but we know perfectly well that not every day brings a customer.
No, sadly not.
Exactly. So before we go into these 7 kinds of shoppers, let's talk about the pandemic. Let's talk about the elephant that's not just in the room, but sitting on all of our heads. You were shut for some of it.
Yes, we closed, I think 2 days before we were obliged to close. I just thought this is going to happen anyway, so we might as well close. And in a rare display of responsibility, I thought actually closing the shop should probably reduce the number of people coming to the town, and consequently, hopefully reduce the chance of an outbreak. So, yeah, I was uncharacteristically responsible. But yeah, we closed for, I think, 116 days, and normally the shop's open 6 days a week. So the only time that it's closed for more than 1 day in any week is at Christmas. And we close for Christmas Day and Boxing Day, and then sometimes there's a Sunday that coincides. So, but yeah, other than that, for 40 years, the shop has been open 6 days a week, and it was. We reopened on the 16th of July, I think, and I was going to wait until self-catering and hotels and B&Bs could reopen, because I thought, well, there's no point in opening before then because we're so tourist dependent. Mm-hmm. But I decided to open a week earlier, and it was a very, very strange experience seeing my first customer for nearly a quarter of a year. And he was a guy who'd driven down from Ayr. He was completely charming, and I opened the shop at 9, and he appeared at about 10:15. And before then, obviously, there hadn't been any other customers, and I was thinking, God, I might as well just close the doors again. And he appeared, and it was like a sort of, I don't know, like a ray of sunshine, which is something I would never use to describe my customers. Yeah. But he was so charming, and he spent about £80, and I thought, right, okay, we're back in business. But yeah, it was a very odd time, and I think it was obviously it's been the same for most people. But being forced to close the business for that long was initially there was a sort of sense of euphoria about it, because you just think, I don't have to deal with customers anymore, and you have time to yourself. And obviously as well, we had the most outstandingly beautiful spell of weather, so I got stuck into garden jobs and things, and it was just great. It was like being on holiday, but it did start to wear thin fairly quickly.
That must have surprised you, given that you've built your brand on being a curmudgeon.
Well, thank you very much. It did surprise me. And the other thing that was interesting was the only shop that I went to for the entire lockdown was the Co-op in Wigtown. And normally in the Co-op, you do see lots of different faces and people you don't recognise, but suddenly it was literally only people you knew. And that was quite strange, and I think that's probably a sort of rural thing. I don't imagine if you went to the supermarket in Edinburgh, you'd just see faces you recognised. But it was quite nice. You end up talking to people in the queue outside, and actually you sort of connect to people a bit better. So there were good and bad elements to the whole lockdown.
You tweeted one day, I can't remember, it was a few weeks ago, you tweeted that during the lockdown and subsequently you sold a tremendous amount of Agatha Christie books, and you were asking other booksellers if they'd noticed a change in people's reading patterns. And it's very, very true, because I am hooked into the crime community, that a lot crime sales...
Not the mafia.
Not that crime community, the crime writing community. Yeah, I always forget that you have to specify. At least that's the story I'm telling. A lot of, crime's doing really, really well now, which seems counterintuitive.
It is, and one of the things that I got loads of emails from people saying, "Oh, you must be so glad of the internet during lockdown to keep business going." But I decided to stop selling online about a year ago, which, with hindsight, may have been quite a considerable mistake. But I just had enough of it. There's something about selling online. It's so impersonal, and people have the opportunity to be really offensive and really rude, because there's that cloak of anonymity. And so I just thought, right, that's it. I'm not going to sell online anymore. And then lockdown happened, and that was it, cutting my own throat. But as soon as we reopened, business, I have to say, has never been so good since we reopened. It's been phenomenal, and it's obviously partly a consequence of people being reluctant to travel abroad and staying within the UK. But it's been phenomenal. And but yes, one of my, probably I would say by far my best-selling author since lockdown was lifted and we started having people in the shop again, is Agatha Christie. And by sheer coincidence, the first book deal that I went out when I was buying books again was at a house near Lockerbie, and there was a massive Agatha Christie collection. And I just thought, well, I'll take that. And the whole lot's gone now already.
Really?
Yeah, it was within a week. It was almost all gone. So Agatha Christie, I don't know whether it's the fact that there's a sort of cozy warmth about her writing, and that there's always a resolution at the end. And I think during a period of uncertainty, people sort of crave that. There's a sort of, when we don't know where we're going, which is where we appear to be at the moment, there doesn't appear to be an obvious end. I think people like reading books where there is a sort of neatly resolved story. So I think that's probably why Agatha Christie sold so well. And she's a great writer as well. So.
She is that. But I was wondering, so I'm wondering if during other periods of of sort of group turmoil, you have also noticed changes in book buying habits. I'm thinking the 2014 referendum or Brexit 2 years later. It may not affect you as much being in the used book trade, but I thought it was worth asking.
Yeah, I haven't noticed any patterns in the past, but then I haven't really been looking for them, and I think things like the referendum, I think people's buying habits probably stayed pretty much the same as they were before that. But in terms of the books that are being written and published, I think that's, you probably know more about this than I do, but I think there's going to be a dramatic change in what comes out in the next few months and what's already being published. So Jenny, my wonderful agent, was down just after lockdown. She decided to come, and she and her husband came down for a visit, and she told me that one of her friends, who's another literary agent, had 2 manuscripts submitted on the same day, both called, during lockdown, both called virus ! So I think it's probably lots of people who have always thought about writing a book have probably during lockdown actually had the opportunity to do it. And I just hope they're not all called virus !
No, the others will be, how to kill my spouse.
Yeah.
Our children, they're buried in the back garden.
Oh, yes. Yeah. How to find the cheapest case of wine online and
Exactly.
things like that. So.
Oh, I have some tips on that. I'll tell you later. In the preface to the book, you describe some random acts of kindness that kind of both startled and warmed the cockles of your heart. Can you tell the audience what kinds of things happened? There were people who deliberately overpaid, and there were other things.
Yeah, so I think the first one was a customer who came in and bought a few books, and I think the total was about £12, and he gave me a £20 note, and I was getting the change out of the till, and he said, no, just keep it, because I know how difficult this time must have been for you, and I just want to make sure that you're still here next time I come to visit. So that was the first one, and it was, it was, I'm going to sound a bit soppy about this, but it was quite heartwarming. Mm-hmm. And the second one was, in fact, I wrote to the person who did this yesterday. I got a letter from someone in Monaco, which basically said that she'd read an article, I think it was in Time magazine by Margaret Atwood, which said that Margaret Atwood was saying this is a really difficult time for small businesses, so whatever you can do to keep them going, I'm sure they'd really appreciate it. And she sent me a cheque for complete stranger, never heard of her, don't know anything about her, sent me a cheque for £300 saying, I hope this helps.
Did she explain why? Had she read the books?
Yeah, well, no, I don't think she had read the books, but she must have just Googled and just found my website or something. So she's a crime fiction reader, so I parcelled up a load of crime fiction and sent it out to her as a thank you. But we're still in touch, and I think those sort of strange bonds that you would never have experienced had it not been for lockdown. I just hope they last, and mm-hmm. Hopefully one day she'll visit the shop and I can thank her in person. But yeah, there are things that I just didn't expect. You kind of almost expect in a situation like that it's going to bring out the most selfish element in people, whereas in fact it does in some people, obviously, and try buying loo roll in the co-op a month before lockdown. But it also brings out a really generous side in people. So it's been a very positive experience.
Well, that's lovely. So
I'm going to have to change my tone here. It's too,
yeah, well, don't
too
worry,
nice.
we'll get snarky. There are 7 types that you've identified, and I'm not going to try to say them in Latin because I was at university the last time I did any Latin, and I think Victoria was still on the throne. I can't remember how to pronounce anything. One of the 7 types is called the expert, and we will find ways to mock the expert, but before we mock the expert, could you tell us a story or more than one story about there's a fine line between being a pedant and being an expert. And you've been lucky enough to have some people come in and actually tell you stuff that was cool that you didn't know.
Yeah, I think I think you can almost divide the expert into 2 types. One of which is the autodidact, the self-taught expert, who is generally very keen to almost humiliate you for not knowing as much as they do about a particular subject. And then the other side of that is people who just have a general interest or a specific interest. And one of them
Shall I hold this up?
yeah, so this book by Patricia Wentworth, I bought from a house in Dumfries just before lockdown. And I was going through all the books and I thought, well, this is a pretty unprepossessing paperback. It's probably not worth anything. And I was looking at it, and the woman whose house I was in scampered over and said, oh, that's really interesting, that book, because I don't know if anybody noticed from the cover, it's a box of
holding it up.
It's a box of chocolates with a syringe on it, and it's obviously a murder. It's crime fiction.
It'll be a
poison. So she told me that it's really, really scarce because it was withdrawn because the chocolate manufacturer, who's named on the front cover, objected to being associated with poison. So they complained to the publisher withdrew it. So that is actually a very scarce book. And so that kind of expert I really love, because there's no sense of lording over you with their knowledge. It's sharing information. And as a bookseller, you have there's so much out there that you will never know about books and publishers and authors. So actually, somebody telling you something like that is really useful, because it can give you the sort of veneer of knowing what you're talking about when you come across it another time. But yeah, the other one, the other sort of experience that I had with a customer who really sort of benefited my knowledge was a guy, and I've written about it a couple of times, so apologies if you've already heard this or read it. But there was I can't remember what period he was writing, in about 1770, I think. A draftsman called Francis Grose was decided to travel around Scotland. He was obviously fairly wealthy, and sketch images of sort of all the ancient ruined buildings. So the book's called Antiquities of Scotland, and it's 2 volumes, and I had a set of it, and a customer came down from, I think it was Edinburgh, and he'd heard that I had this set. And it's not particularly scarce, but this was in very, very good condition. And he came down and he bought it. I think it was £300. And after he'd paid, he said that this is a really, really significant book for collectors of Robert Burns, because Grose and Burns met in a house in Dumfriesshire. I can't remember where it was, but and they had supper together and obviously drank too much. And Burns, being a great advocate for Alloway and Ayrshire, knew that Grose was writing this book and said, "You've got to feature Alloway Kirk." So Grose said, "All right, okay, that's fine. I'll go to Alloway, I'll sketch it and I'll fill it in, but you've got to provide the text for it. So Burns duly disappeared, wrote something, sent it to Gross, and Gross read it and said, "This is rubbish," which you have to have pretty tough kahunas to say that to Robert Burns, I'd imagine. So he sent it back to Burns and said, "Can you write something a bit more supernatural?" And so Burns wrote Tam O'Shanter, and although it did appear in print in a newspaper, I think before that, it's the first book that actually features the entire text of Tam O'Shanter, and it's all thanks to Francis Gross. So these things they're like little nuggets of gold for a bookseller, knowing these things. And I would never have known about that. I would have probably never read about it. But when a customer tells you about it, it's it saves you the effort, really.
That's brilliant. There's also a story in your book that spoke to me because I took an entire semester of in university in Arthurian myth. I love the Arthurian myths, and you tell a story in your book about an edition of the Morte d'Arthur with Aubrey Beardsley. I mean, by the time I get into that story, I was clutching not just my pearls, my heart. I was sobbing. Can you tell that story? It's such an upsetting story.
It's upsetting, but it's also, I suppose, it's just how business works. So I had a customer came in with a few boxes of books, that he was selling that had obviously come from a stately home, and that it was a really nice collection of books, and in amongst it was a 2-volume set of Beardsley's Morte d'Arthur, and I didn't know what it was worth, and they were both signed by Beardsley, both volumes, and I can't remember what I offered the guy, but he was happy with it, and he disappeared. And normally in that situation, I would do a bit of research, and if the book turned out to be worth considerably more than I'd paid, I would get back. I always keep contact details for customers. I'd have got back to him and sorted it out and made sure that he got a fair price for it. But there was an expert who came into the shop, who's a really nice guy, regular customer, and spotted it before I'd had a chance to do any research on it, and made me an offer, which I think was about, it was £800. Anyway, I was quite happy with that, and I thought, well, he's probably got a reasonable bargain. Anyway, I bumped into him about 6 months later, at a book festival in Carlisle, and he said, "Oh, remember that 2-volume set of Beardsley you sold me?" I was like, "Yeah." He said, "I got 19,000 for it at auction in London." And I wasn't annoyed for my own sake because, but I was annoyed for the person who'd sold it to me, because I would have, if I'd known that it was worth that much. And obviously auctions are different. You just need 2 people who are interested in the same thing. It can go from being worth £1,000 to 20,000, in a matter of minutes. But I just felt bad for the guy I'd bought it from, because I felt like I ought to have paid him more, but obviously I couldn't. But yeah, that's things like that happen, and there's, as I mentioned in the book, there's always an element of caveat emptor, also caveat vendor. So if you're selling something, if you're buying something, you might end up being shortchanged, but also if you're selling something, you have to. It comes with the territory. So although it did annoy me, I do accept that the guy did nothing wrong.
Yeah. Fair enough. Now, were you going to read us a little section from the book? Or would you please read us a little
I will. I have to swap glasses because I'm so old now.
Anything you like?
I need 2 pairs of specs. So I haven't rehearsed this, so I apologise if...
But you did write it, so...
I did write it, but that doesn't mean anything. So one of the categories one of the types of customers is the bearded pensioner, and so I'll just read a little bit of that. And I would just like to mention my friend Jan, who was a slight inspiration for this. So one of the things that if you live in Galloway, particularly at the moment actually, because all the B&Bs and hotels and everything are full, so anybody with a motorhome or a caravan seems to descend on the area, and I suppose because of COVID, it's safer. People feel like they're more self-contained. But anyway, bearded pensioner, quite a lot of them appear in caravans and camper vans. So I'll read a little bit of this. So this type includes both males and females, although it tends to be dominated by males by a whisker. Apologies for that. Almost everyone in this group travels the country in a motorhome or a caravan, like a swarm of geriatric locusts, complaining about everything and never buying anything. The top travelling speed is 45 miles an hour, also favoured by farmers who cruise country roads with piles of dead sheep in the back of their pickups, ensuring that everyone else is perpetually late for appointments. Apparently, this is the optimal speed for fuel efficiency, and coincidentally, the optimal speed for annoying people who are trying to get to work. The drivers of the motorhomes rarely care about other road users because they're retired until they happen to require an emergency blast from a defibrillator, don't understand why other road users are in such a rush. They seem to gain particular pleasure from pulling over in scenic country spots overnight, then in the morning depositing the contents of their chemical toilet into the side of the road, moving on 10 minutes before rush hour so that they can begin their daily routine of holding up miles of traffic once again. The bearded pensioner will, given the opportunity, park their huge, ugly Crusader motorhome. They all have names like Crusader and Marauder, right in front of your place of business so that they can walk straight in and obscure it from public view for as long as possible while buying nothing. A distant acquaintance, who I'll call Jan, because that's her name, has a motorhome, an auto rail Scout apparently, which she drives so slowly that she could be overtaken by a melting glacier. Combine harvesters have been known to honk their horns when stuck behind her on country roads. I'm convinced that she's caused more lost hours of work than anything else, except COVID, in the last 10 years. She did ask me to point out, though, that her van doesn't have a chemical toilet. I'm not going to carry on because it gets a bit offensive after that, even more offensive.
You'll have to buy the book to find out what's so offensive. I kept going back and forth the 7 types, trying to figure out which offensive type of customer I was, because I know I'm really guilty of like wandering around and then not buying anything. But I kept stopping at book-loving children, because I was a book-loving child. I mean, my brother says all he remembers was seeing the part in my hair because I always had my face down in a book.
Buried in a book.
Yeah. So I have a lot of time for subspecies, book-loving children. And I was wondering, were you that kind of a child? And if so, what did you read when you were a kid?
I wasn't a huge reader when I was a child. I think my dad used to read quite a lot. And still does, but there wasn't really a sort of culture of reading in our house. But I do, and I remember being at school and being forced to read things and thinking, I'd rather be out, chasing the dog or whatever. I think the first book that I remember being significantly moved by was a book by a guy called Dennis Watkins Pitchford, who wrote under the pseudonym of BB. And he was a naturalist and really into the outdoors and field sports and things. And he wrote a book called The Pool of the Black Witch, which is about a boy fishing for, he knew this enormous trout was in this pool, and the whole thing is about him trying to catch it and the kind of toing and froing of all of that. And it was beautiful, and I just remember that almost everything about it sort of hit the spot for me, and I think that is probably the book that really started me reading. So how about you? What were your interests as a child?
Well, if it was printed, I read it.
Right, back of a cornflakes packet.
I did. I would always read the cereal box while I was eating my breakfast. I read and reread the biography of Helen Keller over and over again. I don't know why. I read the Moomin Troll books out of the school library, and then sort of forgot about them. And because I didn't own them, and I kept growing up. And then I started thinking I had hallucinated the Moomin Trolls. And I was relieved, sort of in my 20s to find out that no, Moomin Trolls were actually a thing.
Exist.
And I wasn't, no drugs had been slipped into those cornflakes. And I still reread Mary Poppins and Charlotte's Web regularly, almost religiously. And I still find new ways to be amazed by them both.
That's funny, because I tend not to reread things because I just always think it's a missed opportunity to read something new.
Well, mostly, but those
are the
what
things
is
you
that,
go
2
back to.
hours of my life to read?
Yeah, that's fair enough. I recently reread 1984, which enormously pretentiously I actually read in 1984. I know, it's a bit embarrassing. But yeah, I was horrified by how depressing it is. It's just unrelenting. But it's a great book. So Orwell's probably the one person I would reread, but probably not many other authors.
Yeah. You tell a story in the book about a rather precocious young reader, because you talk about young families in the book, and there's a young child who was reading To Kill a Mockingbird, which is not an outrageous book for a child to read, but he or she, I can't remember the gender of the child, was reading it at a very, very young age. And you spoke to the parents and they were like, yeah, whatever.
Yeah, it was. I remember it really clearly, actually. He was a boy called Oscar, and he was 7, and he was really into Harry Potter and had, I think, read just about everything. But you could see that he had that passion for reading, which, yes, in somebody that age is really unusual. I think it was quite striking. And Nicky was working in the shop at the time, and we just got talking to his parents, and Nicky asked him, just sort of by way of making conversation, what are you reading at the moment? And he said, To Kill a Mockingbird. And there's some quite difficult subjects in To Kill a Mockingbird. And Nicky, I remember Nicky looking completely astonished and looking at his mother, I think, who just went, shrugged her shoulders and said, well, he wanted to read it. We didn't want to tell him he couldn't. So, yeah, that's what he was reading. So, I wish there were more Oscars in the world.
Yeah. See, that you just made that into a beautiful, lovely story, and I was actually using it as the lead-in to ask you what was the most inappropriate book you read as a child, and now I'm just lowering the tone, right? I'm rolling in the gutter here, and you just made
Looking
that a beautiful story.
I think probably, I suppose there are lots of inappropriate books knocking around in the 1970s that by modern standards would just be deemed irredeemably offensive, but I don't really remember reading any of those. But I do remember at school there were quite a few erotica books being shared, and it was an all-boys school, so there was quite a few things that if the English teacher caught you reading it, I don't think they'd be too happy with you. But speaking of English teachers, I met my English teacher from school again last year. He decided to come to Wigtown, and it was a very odd experience. I hadn't seen him for, 30 years.
Had you been a good student of his?
I think so. Oddly enough, he kept all his notes for essay marks and things, all handwritten, and so he gave them to me, and I think I did okay. I wasn't a great student, but I don't think I was particularly awful either. So yeah, that was a really...
But in any place did it say potential to write several best-selling
No, definitely not. Yeah, if he'd had space in the margins to write something, I'm pretty sure it wouldn't have been as flattering as that.
Tell us about the occultists. Now, my eyesight's so bad, I kept reading that as the Oculus. And I said, how can that be a whole separate subgenre of, why do they get a whole chapter? But in fact, they are occultists. And they are quite colorful.
Well, if the colour is black, then yes, they tend to dress
Don't they
in...
wear purple as well?
Sometimes they wear purple. Lee, you could fit the...
I could, although I prefer to think of this as burgundy.
Oh, right. Yeah, they are a kind of curious group, and I don't really see that there used to be more of them. I think when I bought the shop, I think they're sort of slightly dying breed. But yeah, they generally tend to wear black and heavy makeup, and sort of, as you'd imagine, a typical goth, I suppose. But yeah, they're...
Well, what are they looking for? The Satanic Bible? And I
Well-
have a friend who had a copy.
Well, generally, they're looking for... Generally, it's something by Aleister Crowley.
Of course.
Who's the great beast. And we do get quite a lot of his stuff in, actually. And it does still sell quite quickly. But they're also looking... I think I mentioned it in the book. They're looking... have you ever seen the film The Ninth Gate? I think it's got Johnny Depp in it. It's a Polanski film.
I did. It's about a book, isn't it?
It is.
Because I did see it recently on television, and it was one of those late nights where I was either too tired or too drunk to get up and go to bed. And it's about a rare book, and yet they never wear gloves when they hold this rare book. And they're always throwing it in their backpack.
They're quite cavalier about it.
I was screaming laughter the whole time.
I think it's a really good film. It got absolutely panned when it came out. And basically, Johnny Depp is this character. I think it's fairly sure it's Johnny Depp.
It is.
So he's trying to track down for a collector this book, with which, if you get every edition of it, I think there are like only 5, and put it together, it gives you this sort of some sort of clue as to how to summon Mephistopheles and have your every darkest wish come true. And I think is what the real occultist collectors are looking for, something that they can communicate with Satan. So yeah.
I think Satan's here talking to us now, quite frankly. Not in this room necessarily, but...
Speaking of Satan, where's that cat?
He's down there. Captain the Bookshop cat is here. Unfortunately, he's off camera. But he is a celebrity with his own Instagram account and all. So.
Yeah, so when I was coming down, it must be about an hour ago, the cat, who never follows me anywhere, decided to follow me and is sitting over there. Captain, are you going to perform? No? So anyway, we do have a celebrity guest, the cat. He's having a good scratch now.
Yeah. How are the occultists at all in league with the conspiracy theorists, who are another subgenre in the book? And also, what's the maddest conspiracy theory you've ever been told?
Oh, God. I mean, the conspiracy theorists generally have 2 interests, and they overlap. So usually they're obsessed with JFK's assassination, but also with Jack the Ripper. So if I'm ever out buying and I come across 3 or 4 books about Jack the Ripper, you can almost guarantee that there'll be another half dozen about JFK. And of course that spills over now into the whole 9/11 thing, and obviously COVID. There's plenty of conspiracies about that. So, but I do have a regular customer who is a very nice man, but he's interminable. As soon as you get him started on any subject, forget it. The next half hour is gone at least. So my friend Robin was working in the shop one day, and I'd warned him. I saw this guy come in. I said, Robin, don't talk to him. Just don't say anything, whatever he says to you. And so Robin dutifully obliged. And when it came to paying, Robin said to this guy, "Oh, you can pay contactless if you like," which unleashed this whole sort of monologue for the next half hour about cybersecurity, and so he's not the weirdest by any stretch of the imagination, but he's a fairly regular. He has thoughts about lots of subjects, which I tend to disagree with, but he's not afraid to express them.
Oh gosh, and another group that I can understand why this would provoke your would pique your pique are the people. They tend to be outdoors people who like to read all the Ordnance Survey maps, refold them incorrectly, and leave without paying for anything.
Yeah,
Talk about them for a little bit.
They fall into the bearded pensioner group, which I really apologise for being so making such sweeping generalisations, considering that most of my customers are pensioners. So yeah, sorry, but yeah, they tend to be motorhome enthusiasts, and if you ever see the motorhome with two bikes strapped to the back, that's this category. So they tend to wear lycra, which is quite an unforgiving material, particularly when you're bending over to do up your bike clips or something. They come into the shop and they obviously they're combining their motorhome trip with a cycling trip, and they come into the shop and they, for the express purpose of planning their bike route, so they generally stand in the most, and if you unfold an Ordnance Survey map, I mean, they're huge, so they tend to, quite often they put them on the floor as well, so that other customers can't get past, and you can see them sort of plotting their next day's route or the week's route, fold them all back up incorrectly, probably tear them a couple of times and put them back on the wrong shelf. So yeah, they're not my favourite types, and they never buy anything either, possibly because they want to keep their panniers light, but...
Well, how much does a map weigh?
Well, also, they can stick it in their camper van, or their caravan, but yeah, it's... they definitely feature in the top 10 most annoying types.
Okay, so one of the top 10 least annoying types is the local historian. You talk with such love and affection of the local historians. Can you tell the audience what it is that appeals to you about them?
Yeah, definitely. I think they are in the sort of subgroup of generally self-published authors, which most booksellers will tell you, your heart sinks as soon as someone comes in with a pile of self-published books, normally illustrated by their granddaughter, and with very little. Not that there's anything wrong with self-publishing. I think Beatrix Potter, her first book was self-published, and what's his name? Remembrance of Things Past. Proust's first Swan's Way, I think, was self-published. So yeah, some really, really great authors have self-published, but there's some really terrible ones as well. But the group within that self-published category who I do really admire are the local historians, and they tend to be much more modest. So somebody who's written, a children's book illustrated by their granddaughter will come in and tell you that all their friends and neighbours have told them how wonderful it is. But of course, that's to avoid boundary wall disputes and things. Whereas the self-published historian, local historian, is a much more modest person generally, and they kind of shuffle in a little bit embarrassed and awkward and tell you about, a book they've written about, I don't know, a local airfield in the Second World War or something like that. But those books are generally, extremely well researched, and they'll be unique in as much as nobody else. They'll have interviewed people who've probably now died. They've gathered information that, were it not for them, would probably be lost forever. So, those are the self-published authors that I admire the most. They are capturing valuable information that's going to be an future archive, and they are always really modest about it. So there's something quite charming about them.
They sound like they could be cousins of the really lovely kind of experts.
They could, yeah. Yes. Yeah. I thought you were going to say cousins of the occultists, but I don't think so.
No. And another group that got you said every bookseller has the purest love for sci-fi fans and graphic novel collectors. Now, why is that?
I don't know. I think there's just something about them that, they do kind of conform to a stereotype, largely. But again, that's another sweeping generalization. But they just have such a passion and enthusiasm. And they nearly always buy something, and they have, although they tend to stick within sci-fi, within that whole sort of range of sci-fi, they generally tend to have pretty broad tastes. So they, it's not just the Douglas Adams or whatever that they collect. They'll look for anything. And one of the interesting things I love about sci-fi, but I love getting hold of sci-fi collections because they always sell quickly. And one of the things I like most about them is that the cover illustrations tend to be completely mad. They're really. I think I said something in the book about how the publishers must insist that the illustrators spend at least a week on a massive dose of LSD before they commit pen to paper, because a lot of them they're beautiful, but they're not like anything else you ever see. And they tend to go mostly straight to paperback, so they're cheap. But the sci-fi fans never complain, never argue about the price of a book, and just are generally quite a happy bunch.
And similarly, the graphic novel?
Very similar, yeah. It's funny, I don't come across much in the way of graphic novels. I would like to, if I ever do come across them, I do tend to buy as whatever I find. But they're just quite scarce things, even now that they've sort of crossed that threshold into, from being sort of almost for cartoony children's things to actually having, with Mouse particularly. I think Mouse was the one that pushed that boundary.
Persepolis or Persepolis?
That was that Booker nominated, was it?
I can't recall, but that was also very mainstream, very beloved.
Yeah, so I think those two have kind of given graphic novels a much more legitimate literary credentials than they had previously.
Yeah. I'm havering here because the lovely tablet setup is not feeding me questions from the audience.
Maybe there are no questions.
No, there's something happening there, but I'm just too old I can't see at that distance even with my spectacles on. I have more questions of my own, but in the 5 minutes we have left, I would have loved to. Can you read any of those questions?
Do you ever worry that your curmudgeonly persona would put potential customers off? Yes.
Okay, we'll do it that way.
Yeah, I do, and I really don't want to put customers off, and I hope I'm not that curmudgeonly in real life. But I try not to be rude to customers. And what I tend to do is, if people are rude to me, I'll be rude back to them. And I think it's almost like I feel like I'm holding a mirror up to people's behaviour, and if people are polite and friendly, I will of course be polite and friendly back. I'm not just going to be rude for the sake of being rude. But if someone's rude to me, I I don't really have a problem with, giving back as good as I've got.
Yeah.
So, shall I see if I can read another one?
Yeah, they're just not coming through here.
Okay.
It's not that I can't read them on here, it's that they're not coming through on here. We can do one more.
Okay. I can't read another one.
Okay, let me ask you a question then.
Okay, hang on a second. Do you still detest children as much as the first two books might suggest? No!
Apparently, I should hope not.
No, I have one of my own now. So, if children are well behaved, that's great. I love seeing children in the shop because these are the future readers. These are the people that are going to keep bookshops going if we can survive. So, no, I don't detest children.
We need more Oscars.
Need more Oscars, yeah. He was utterly charming.
So, has writing books changed the kinds of books you like to read now? Or not?
Yes, I think that's a good point. I think it probably has. I tend to read more books about bookshops and about books. So that's, in a way, that's a sort of educational thing for me, trying to get myself a bit better informed. And in fact, the book I'm about to start reading now is Reisman Steps.
Oh, yes, I want to read that. In fact, didn't I ask you if you had a copy
you
to
did,
sell me?
yeah. Well, Charlotte Higgins recommended it to me.
Yeah,
so
Backlisted
Arnold
Podcast did you should listen to that before you read it.
I think that was the one that Charlotte was on.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's my next endeavour. But I've just read a book. I think I suppose in a way I'm trying to actually read things that I probably feel I ought to read rather than want to read, and it turns out that actually they're really good.
Yeah.
So I've just read Dave the Locust.
Oh God, yes, Nathaniel West, he's brilliant.
It's a fantastic book. So I finished that on the train up
Read
from
Miss
London.
Lonely Hearts next.
Miss Lonely Hearts. So they're very similar in some respects.
Yeah,
so
they are.
he's got a fantastic sense of the surreal.
Yeah.
So when he's going around the back lot in Hollywood and he goes from the desert to sort of Victorian drawing room and he's just wandering around film sets. He's a great writer. I really like him.
Terrible tragic death.
What happened to him?
Car crash with his wife, I think.
Quite young, presumably.
Younger than he should have been, yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, so now, see, this is the thing. We should have just spent the hour talking about
gossiping
books we
about
love.
books.
But that's not what we're here for. We're here to remind everybody that it's the 7 kinds of people you find in bookshops, on sale in all good bookshops and maybe a few disreputable bookshops
Like
as
mine.
well, like Shaun's. The author is Shaun Bythell. We are the Wigtown Book Festival. This has been our first event of 2020. We hope that you liked it enough to buy books and to make a donation. And this is when I would ask the audience, of which there are none, to give you a round of applause and say thank you. So I'm going to do that. Thank you.
Well, no, thank you, Lee.
Thank you so much.
My
It's
pleasure.
been an absolute pleasure.
It's been mine. Thank you.